All right, let's get to it. So, the good. Kaoru, best girl. Next slide. Basically, Kaoru is great. I don't actually know how much of Yakuza 3 Kaoru is present for. I really don't know. I have no idea. I've been trying as best as I can to not, for every entry that we play, to not spoil myself going into the next one. As tempting as it is, it's actually super easy to do so if you really allow yourself to rabbit hole down the Yakuza wikis out there. You will just fly into spoilers. I learned that very early on, so I just try to keep myself as ignorant as possible going into each entry. But Kaoru's best girl, no doubt about it. She's the best character in Kiwami 2 for sure. Amazing, very well acted, just great. Kaoru's great. Ryuji is a pretty likable villain this time, so I will give credit here between Kiwami 2 and Kiwami 1. Ryuji's way better in every capacity than like pretty much any of the antagonists were really in 1. I mean, Nishiki was there, but I gotta say, like, I wasn't personally super strong in 1 of Nishiki's, tone pitch, really, right? Between in 0 how he's like your bro, and then 1 he's like your evil bro. It just felt way too sharp, and I know there's probably only so much they can do about that when you're going between a game's prequel that's made 4 to 5 entries later, but I don't know. Ryuji's a pretty likable villain overall. I always like the weird, crazy villain types that still somehow manage to live by a code, which is exactly what Ryuji is. So I think it was pretty likable. I wouldn't say compelling. Nothing about him is really compelling, but he's likable. Majima feeling more like a character than Yakuza 1. Very true. I think Majima was actually way more involved in the story here in 2 than he was in 1. In 1, he was basically kind of like, really kind of just like a jester for Kiryu to bump into, right? Like, just kind of like a, I don't want to just say like a crazy guy that Kiryu runs into, because really, that's what Majima is for, like, I feel like most of the games. But it just felt more like he was just like, had no personality really at 1 besides that, right? Nothing outside of just being somebody who fights Kiryu. So he felt a lot deeper here in Kiwami 2. Not to the extent of 0, of course, but they actually did a much better job with stuff like the Majima Saga and all the other stuff to make you actually care about Majima in this particular entry. So that was good. Yuki and the entire Cabaret crew, for sure. Absolutely banger. I very much so enjoyed that section this time. I actually, even though I never finished the Cabaret section in 0, I actually think this Cabaret minigame is probably better anyway. So that was actually a lot of fun. I had a shit ton of fun with all the characters in the Cabaret Club. I thought that they were all nice, unique, and just fun to be around. And then Kawara was deeper than expected. Kawara is the crazy cop guy who's Kaoru's father, and also happens to like be a mass murdering piece of shit. I actually like that character. Ended up liking that character a lot. I think it was actually really pretty cool. It was just kind of interesting to see like a law enforcement dude who's really playing all sides in a lot of ways. So he was an interesting character. I kind of thought he would just be like, a wash-up cop type, kind of like how Date is. Date is basically that, right? Kind of like, I'm too old for this shit, kind of like detective guy. But no, Kawara, I'm going to say his name wrong right now, was, I think, a pretty cool character. So I actually enjoyed that part of the whole Jinglun Mafia story with everything, every part that he was inside of that, surrounding that. So, all right, the bad. So basically, to make it really simple, every bad guy who's not Ryuji sucks. Pretty much that's what it boils down to. So Takashima, who's this guy, right, who was one of the Omi generals or Omi captains, who really honestly doesn't do much for the majority of the game until he, appears at the end and is like, I'm the mastermind behind everything. Yeah. He's I don't know. He kind of sucks. I found him completely like paper thin personally. Yeah, he was a piece of crap. I just did not enjoy having him around in the game. All the other Omi Alliance captains, I thought indeed all of them were pretty bad. So Sengoku, mostly pretty pointless. There's like one other I'm missing who I can't even remember. One other who's not Ryuji, right? But they were all just like pretty whatever. Not really anything more than pretty thin excuses to like have Kiryu fight people, I guess, to keep fighting encounters in the game. So they were pretty weak ass. And then, of course, Daigo is weak for being a Dojima. So, of course, Daigo is supposed to be Dojima's son. And at the beginning of the game, they kind of make Daigo look like he's supposed to be like, big shit, right? Big hot shit because he's Dojima's son. And he's supposed to unite the Tojo clan together and all this other stuff. But he was really just a big pile of nothing. After the whole saga where he goes and basically gets like, his ass handed to him and kidnapped by the Omi Alliance and eventually rescued, he's pretty much out of the picture for the rest of the game after that, and goes back to being, the Kiryu show again, right? So Daigo's pretty whatever. I mean, like, I was honestly expecting a lot more out of that character because he honestly seemed kind of cool, and I kind of figured he would have like a lot more redeeming moments than he actually had. So that was kind of disappointing. All right, story, the good. So the Jingwon Mafia is effectively ruthless. So yes, I actually think the Jingwon Mafia was, and everything kind of surrounding that part of the story with like their entire history and that stuff, I thought that was actually pretty compelling. They do a pretty good job demonstrating just how like ruthless the Jingwon Mafia is to the townspeople, as well as to the whole war that they have with the Tojo clan and all the other stuff. So I thought that was actually a pretty good part of the story. Everything surrounding the Jingwon Mafia was pretty good. As I kind of already mentioned, Kawara's dev is good. Everything surrounding, his major role in the history of the Jingwon Mafia, and him basically being the one to try to make sure that Ryuji and Kaoru's mother makes it out, that whole mess alive, and everything surrounding that, and the level of effort he goes to protecting her and the survivors. Makes him like really complicated, a much more complicated character than I honestly thought I had any expectation of him being. So that was pretty good. And then getting some closure to Yakuza 0 finally. So, tying up some loose ends with Makoto via the Majima saga. That whole thing was really good, I have to say. I think they were very, very effective in how they played out the Majima saga, even though it was very short, right? It was only, like 2-ish hours? Like, not even like 2.5, like probably 2 hours, 10 minutes, maybe at most. Even with that in mind, I actually thought the Majima saga was quite good, so. Now, of course, Majima Saga was an addition to Kiwami 2. Definitely wasn't in the original game. Thank God they included it though, because it really, I think, helped lift up a lot of the tie-ins that they try to make from Yakuza 0 through Kiwami 1 and Kiwami 2. And it's probably pretty easy to say by this point, with the amount of effort they put between 0 and tying 0 to 1 and 2 with these, you know, Kiwami remakes, there's probably not going to be, you know, a direct Kiwami 3 that ties itself to 0, right? Like, I don't doubt there will eventually be a 3 remake at some point, but 3, I believe, was a PS3 game and not a PS2 game like 1 and 2 were. So, you know, with 3 being a PS3 game, I don't think the need is quite there for as huge of a facelift. And they're probably going to do, you know, besides the fact that they just released HD ports of those games fairly recently, right, 3 through 5, we're probably not going to see remake treatment of those anytime soon. So I think that's probably supposed to be Sega's way of saying that Zero's tie-in into the series effectively ends with the end of 2, which makes sense. It does. It actually does make some sense based on the characters who are present in both 1 and 2. So that basically helped, like, you know, provide the final piece of closure tying 0 there, which is very good for them to do. So I give them a lot of praise for that. Would be surprised by Kiwami 3 at this point. Yeah, I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, if at all. I think there might be an HD, like a complete remake of 3, but it probably won't be called Kiwami 3, I don't think. It would probably be called something else, right? Maybe to separate it from, like, this kind of remake series that they've done directly for to tie into 0. Alright, so the bad. Too many end-of-game ass pulls, and the end is a mess as a result. I mean, I don't know what else to say here, man. Like, the entire ending with, like, Terada and, you know, Takashima and Ryuji all just, like, kind of piling on in there, and then basically all of them dying. It's just, like, completely ridiculous. What's really funny is I actually don't even feel like they wrote themselves into a corner towards the end. I really don't. Like, prior to the final chapter, I wasn't sitting there being like, oh man, you know, they got so many loose ends to tie up, because they really didn't. You know, the way they kind of phrased it from chapter 14 and 15 was like, oh my gosh, you gotta finish this whole thing with the Omi Alliance by, you know, duking it out with Ryuji, right? So once you go up to, like, the top of whatever it's called, Millennium Tower, and you go do the whole shenanigans again on Millennium Tower, it's this really oh, not Millennium Tower, shoot, it's not Millennium Tower, what is it? It's Kamurocho Hills. There we go. The construction project. So once you get to the top of Kamurocho Hills and you see everybody there, it just doesn't make any sense to me at all whatsoever. So yeah, I mean, all those ass pulls at the end, I was really kind of like, why? But, you know, I know that overall this is not, like, the best Yakuza game. I know that some of the ones coming up are, like, pretty highly regarded, and not from a fighting standpoint. One thing I will say about that I hear about Yakuza 3 a lot is that Yakuza 3 actually has some of the worst fighting, so I'm very much so not looking forward to that. But I think people say Yakuza 3's story is pretty interesting, so we'll see what happens with that. Anyway, most of Ryuji's antics exist to push the plot. Exactly what it sounds like. Ryuji does all sorts of really weird stuff to really pretty much just do that, just, like, keep things moving. But I think that's probably not that bad compared to some other things, just because he's kind of, you know, a character who is somewhat mischievous, right? So I guess it's, like, not the worst. It makes some sense. And then poor Haruka being stuck in an orphanage, Pepe hands. I think it's kind of funny how the writers at the beginning of this game are just like, just shove Haruka in the orphanage for a long time. And so she basically spends literally half of the game just stuck in the orphanage for like no damn reason, just to let Kiryu just go on his parade or whatever, to go beat up Omi Alliance people. And of course, you know, they bring her back midway through the game, but it's kind of the same thing with her over and over again. She's kind of treated as, like, you know, not really a nuisance, but kind of a nuisance for Kiryu. I will say that she's slightly less annoying in this one than the first one. but not by much. She still gets like kidnapped here, and you still have to deal with her being kidnapped, which I feel like has to be some sort of, that must have been a meme in this series long ago, right? I wonder if that's going to be true in 3. I'm going to guess yes. Whole Kamurocho invasion was really underwhelming. I did think this was insanely underwhelming because they kind of do this huge build up with Ryuji's like, I'm going to give you 3 days before we go and blow up Kamurocho or whatever, and then like a bunch of stuff happens and the game's like not important, right? In between, you know, when Ryuji tells you that and when you ultimately go to Kamurocho, and then once you're in Kamurocho, you fight like a handful of enemies, and they're like, oh my gosh, there's 27 bombs in the city, and like, oh no! And so all the bombs end up getting disarmed except for one that's with Majima, and it was basically just like a whole like joke scene anyway. So it's like, really? like it did feel really underwhelming. Felt kind of pointless. But well, that's the game, I guess. Alright, so mini-game selection here was actually pretty okay. So I would say overall mini-game selection was probably better than 1, especially in terms of quality, and that's probably due to really more the fact that this game was built on the new engine and not the old engine. So, you know, of course we didn't have PCF anymore, sad face, Pepe hands, but, you know, that was bound to happen, right? We're not going to have it for the rest of the series at this point. So, not a huge deal. But we did get Cabaret Club Grand Prix, which was pretty banger. Modular construction was alright. I won't say it's great. I don't feel it was great. I think there's a lot of problems with the AI, actually, in it. But, you know, it was not a bad little mini distraction. It was kind of like a weird RTS tower defense kind of thing. A very interesting kind of minigame. And then toilets was whatever, although honestly, like, it was kind of interesting. I wish I could figure out the hang of it, but it was just completely unintuitive somehow. And then you had straight up de facto copies of Virtual On and Virtua Fighter 2 in the game, just completely in there, which I thought was pretty cool. You know, they kind of took the arcade that they usually have in 0 and 1 to basically the next level. So that was pretty neat. And then there's golf. Fuck golf. That golf mini game was kind of bullshit. It went from being like totally reasonable to being completely unreasonable very, very quickly. So, but you know, overall, it honestly wasn't too bad. It really could have been way worse than this. I know that things are probably going to keep getting more and more evolved with minigames. I am going to be particularly interested to see what happens with 3 and minigames in 3, because I know that 1 and 2 are pretty sparse, and the Kiwami treatment really helps add in a lot of stuff there to make the minigame selection feel a lot more like newer entries in the series. So I believe 3 is the first game that actually has karaoke as a minigame, which, by the way, karaoke was in here in Kiwami too, but we only did it a few times because the music selection wasn't particularly great. So it was largely remixed, with the exception of like maybe 1 or 2 songs, largely remixes of songs from 0 and 1. Join the team, we build shit. Alright. Combat. So, a couple of notes on combat. So, Kiwami actions weren't really a thing anymore, which was an interesting choice in some ways. An interesting choice. They kind of replaced Kiwami actions instead with that kind of like button mashing quick time event thing that you get like when a boss enemy is at its like final 5% health, and it just like, you basically just insta kill it at that point. Which, you know, to me, I'm kind of like whatever about it, because, you know, fighting in these games is extremely repetitive anyway, and kind of mediocre. But it is kind of a disappointment in a slight way, just because it feels like a slight step back. However, I will say that the 5 EXP system that's in this game, between the 5 different types of EXP, affecting you can get a lot more EXP from food than you ever could before. I mean, you always could get some EXP from food, but this was like on a whole new level. The way they kind of rebalance the way that EXP and stats work in this was like actually a huge improvement over both 0 and 1. So I would say less useless skills than the prior 2 games. Yeah, that's definitely true too. So between like all the different categories that you had available to you, the fact that I could, if I really wanted to, just sit there and grind passives like, you know, my heat meter, health meter, attack or defense, and just concentrate solely on that if I so desired, I thought was really good. Gave me a lot more ability to do stuff like target the specific skills I wanted instead of getting a bunch of bullshit skills that I don't want or won't ever use while collecting some other buffs along the way, right? So I think they did a pretty good job with that overall. I would actually say that this particular skill and EXP system in this game is probably the best of the 3 so far. So I would actually say this is the best that fighting has actually ever been between 0, 1, and 2, for sure. Now, it's interesting to think about because considering this uses the same engine as 6, I do kind of wonder if 6 has exactly the same way that EXP works in that game, too. So we'll find out once we get there. Weapons actually being useful. This to me was kind of a big deal because weapons were always something I felt like I should be excited about in 0 and 1, but you never really use them much, and the game never really makes it easy to use them. In this game, the game actually encourages you to use them and gives you, you know, more abilities with them, basically, right? Because there's actually a lot more weapon-centric heat actions in this game than there ever was in 0 and 1. So I thought that was actually very cool because, for one, it makes fighting a little bit less boring, and 2, it makes fighting a little bit easier with bosses, but not in like a cheap way, because plenty of bosses in this game use weapons. So they're kind of encouraging you to fight weapons with weapons or get more creative the way you fight, which I thought is definitely good. It's definitely good that they did that, because otherwise fighting in this game gets insanely stale, which is part of the reason why we're playing on easy, right? Because the game is pretty flat in that category a lot of the time. Alright. Boss fights still sort of cheap, though. Yep. Even though boss fights in this game are way better than in 1 because we played it on easy, there were still a couple of fights that felt insanely unfair. Not because they were hard, or because I felt like I was losing a lot or anything like that. Like I did with a few fights in 1 where it just felt insanely difficult, even on normal. But because even on easy, there's just some enemies that just like spot dodge basically in place what feels like endlessly with like endless amount of stamina to do it. And it would just be to an insane degree, right? Like you'd be swinging them with a sword like crazy and they would just spot dodge in place and they just wouldn't receive damage. It's like completely nuts. Which in a game like this doesn't really work, right? So yeah, so that was kind of dumb, but overall, though, I would still say this is the best that the Brawler combat system has ever been so far. So I expect, from what I know about Kiwami 3's fighting in particular, I expect a huge downgrade. So we are going to be very light on fighting Kiwami 3 if we can help it. Or not Kiwami 3, Yakuza 3 if we can help it. Because I've heard enemies are both dodge and block crazy, especially. So we are going to be very light on fighting as much as we can. So where does that bring us here for this game? 7. I'm going to say it's a 7 out of 10. So that puts us in between the first Yakuza 1, which you gave a 6, and Yakuza 0, which we gave an 8. This basically makes the order more or less, I think, exactly what everybody's expecting. 0 is still the best one because the story is so insanely good in 0. Yakuza 1 is the worst of the 3 so far for lots of different reasons, really. And then this one is the second best because the characters are a lot more interesting. The whole Jingwon Mafia thing is a lot more interesting than anything that happened with Jingu in 1. Jingu is like such an awful villain in 1. He's both like a piece of shit person, which is fine for a villain, but he's also like completely uncompelling as a villain. Like I just couldn't get behind anything that fucking happened in that game. I felt like, so yeah, Jingu kind of sucked. I'm glad that we don't really have to deal with any of that shit anymore from 1. 1 is definitely the kind of game where I feel like I would never touch it again, like just very, very honestly, beyond like some very light research. 2 is actually a game I feel like I could potentially touch again to do like more stuff, just because particularly like the way that how polished Kiwami 2 feels compared to Kiwami 1. Kiwami 2 feels very polished. So the game is overall very pretty too. I didn't discuss that a whole lot. Being in the second newest engine, actually, since Yakuza 8 is out, or 7 is out. Being very new, it's a lot prettier. I did actually really, really like the way that they made some of these areas look like. Kamurocho looks pretty good, but Sotenbori especially looks really, really nice in this game. Especially the main area of Sotenbori on like the north side of the bridge, right around where the Cabaret Grand is and stuff. So like visually the game looks pretty damn good. It's going to be somewhat sad to go from such a great looking game here with like some of the best face renders I've ever seen in any game. Some of the best cinematography we've ever seen in any game. I mean, like, just amazing cutscene direction. Really, like, truly amazing cutscene direction in this game. It's gonna suck to go from that to 3, I think. But I am very interested to see the story in 3, so it's all right. Yep. I think that's more or less it. You know, short of it. 0's the best so far. 2's the second best. 1's the worst. We'll see how 3 ranks in between those. So what do you think, chat? How do you think this game compares to those two? I think it's probably the right way of looking at it. Sounds right, yeah. Only one that really hit me so far. That's fair. And a lot of what makes 0 so good is that the dual protagonist approach in 0, with the sheer amount of time that's spent on both Kiryu and Majima in that game, and the way they build everything up is so good in 0. It really is. It's so good. So they were able to get away with doing like a little bit of that with the Majima Saga, but the Majima Saga is very short. So it was really more like a taste of that. So, but yeah, I think that's basically it.